Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Linux for Claris FileMaker Server. My name is Steve Winter. I'm a former primary school teacher. I run a company called Matatiro Solutions. We're based in New Zealand. I've lived around the world quite a bit, but I've been back in New Zealand 4 years now and really enjoy the lifestyle there. One of the key attractions for moving back was my dog in the bottom right-hand corner. He'll pop up on a couple of slides to tell you that that's an important thing you need to take note of. I've been doing this for a little while now. In fact, I've been doing this so long that I remember when FileMaker Server ran on Linux the first time round. And that was back in 5.5. And for a lot of years, every DevCon as they were then, I'd bump into Rick Coleman and I'd go, Rick, when are we going to get the Linux version of Server? And he'd just kind of laugh and wander off. But one year he said, soon. And that was really exciting to me because it meant that we were going back to a place that I was sad we'd left at any point along the way. Over the course of this session, we're going to have a look at why you would choose to use Linux instead of another operating system for your FileMaker Server. We'll have a look at the 6 steps to success, have a look at what DevOps means and a tool called Ansible. Ansible's one of the tools that I'm going to show in this session. I'm not affiliated with any of these things. They're just tools that I've found really useful in my working. One of the reasons that I really want to encourage people to get FileMaker Server running in Linux, and particularly on your local machine, is that I have this feeling that anytime we're doing development, we should be using FileMaker Server rather than doing local development. And one of those tools that I'm only going to peripherally mention is AutoFMS, because it runs on your server and it provides those seamless deployments from one environment to the other. If you're developing on server, it makes it really easy to get your solutions into the places that they need to be. One thing that I will note, I did a version of the session with Nick Orr from Goya in the Reconnect conference in Sydney a couple of years back, and it was Nick that reckoned that there were 6 key things to success, and I've stolen his idea, or kind of embellished his idea a little bit. So why Linux? Linux runs on a huge range of hardware. Not just different hardware, but lots of service providers. There are cloud providers. You can run it on a local machine. You can run it pretty much anywhere you like. You can use Docker, a containerization system, which we're not going to talk about today, but Docker is another way. And there's a really great engineering blog that the Claris team put out about running server on Docker, if you're interested in knowing more about that. In this session, we're really going to look at running Linux natively in some way. Pretty much the entire web runs on Linux, and so really we want to be part of that as well. Default installs of Windows, for example, have around 50 services that you just don't need when you're running a FileMaker Server. And one of the drawbacks of that is you might be tempted to use them. For many years, Claris have said your FileMaker Server should be just your FileMaker Server. And so if you haven't got these other shiny things sitting there waiting for you to use them, you're going to be less tempted to do so. And you're going to stick with that idea that FileMaker Server is a FileMaker Server, and that's all it does. And that definitely has an impact, particularly on performance. The fewer services also provides another bonus to us in that it increases the security of your installation. If you're only running the software that you have specifically installed on your server, you know what's there and you understand the security implications around that. You're not being concerned about, have I inadvertently turned on Windows file sharing and therefore made my entire server accessible over the internet. One of the final benefits that we'll cover at the end of this session is around automation. Because so much of the web is run on Linux, there are a huge range of tools that help you with automating the configuration, the management, the maintenance, and as I mentioned, things like AutoFMS that work seamlessly to help you with all of those processes as well. Linux is also a relatively cost-effective operating system. You're not having to pay the Microsoft tax because you're not paying license fees. The other thing is that although the tech specs for FileMaker Server for Linux are the same as for Windows, my experience is you can run Linux FileMaker servers with much fewer resources. You can basically halve the number of cores and halve the amount of RAM you need, unless you're trying to do WebDirect, at which point you're paying the Java tax and you need to make sure you really ramp up your resources, because WebDirect and Java are quite resource intensive. So those are all the reasons why I think we should use Linux for our FileMaker server. Why not use Linux? I don't know. I think just the fear of the unknown for a lot of people. And you feel like you're losing something when you go to a Linux server, because you don't have that desktop, you don't have the click, the mouse, and so on. You're relying on using the command prompt. And so in some respects, it's the fear of the unknown. Hopefully, in providing you with my 6 key steps at the beginning and some ways to automate FileMaker server deployment, it'll be a bit less scary by the end of this session. There are lots of different distributions of Linux, distros as they're referred to. Claris have made the choice of that really easy for us. They only support Ubuntu. So which operating system are we going to use on Linux? We're going to use Ubuntu, because that's the one that Claris have chosen. They started out using a different operating system. There were some challenges around that. They were originally using CentOS. They decided that becoming a closed source operating system was not for them, and so they've gone with Ubuntu. Ubuntu has a release every 6 months, and in the even-numbered years, in the April release, they release what's called an LTS, a long-term support version. So you'll hear of versions like 22.04. That is the April release from 2022. And that will be an LTS version, which means that it is fully supported for 5 years and then has an additional period of security fixes that come after it. You also get releases like 22.10, which is an October 22, 23.4, 23.10, and so on. Those are just short-term releases, and they're only supported for a relatively short period of time. Claris only provides builds for the LTS versions of the operating system. Right now, they provide builds for 22.04, so the April 2004, and the previous, the 20. They don't yet support 24.04. There have been some challenges around resource management in that version of the operating system, and I suspect Claris are probably waiting for those to be resolved before we see a build for 24.04. The other decision that you do need to make when considering hardware and your operating system is the architecture of the server itself, whether you're going to use an ARM operating system or whether you're going to use an Intel operating system. For those of us who are using modern Mac computers, that decision gets made for us because they use an ARM chip. If you're using a cloud provider to provide you with your Linux server, many of them will offer only an Intel operating system, but some, like AWS, you can actually specify that you want an ARM operating system. There are some benefits to using an ARM operating system in terms of performance, but in general, you're going to find it simpler to stick with the Intel architecture. One thing that you do need to consider in that is plugins. If you are using any plugins which you want to install on your server, you need to ensure that there are builds for the architecture that you choose. So if you do want to use an ARM operating system for some reason, for example, you're running a virtual machine on your Mac, and you need a plugin, then you do need to make sure that they are available. It is possible to do something called emulation, where you run an Intel operating system on an ARM chip, but I wouldn't recommend that unless you're trying to solve a specific plugin-related issue. You will definitely see performance suffer if you do that. They're going to keep doing that, and it's going to freak me out every time. The next decision is choosing your hardware. Choosing the operating system was easy. Ubuntu, that's all. As far as hardware goes, there are kind of 3 options. The first is actual local hardware, like get a physical machine. Lots of older, previously Windows machines, or the last model of Intel Mac make great machines to use for testing and development, because you can install Linux, Ubuntu as the native operating system on that hardware, and you'll get great performance out of them, significantly better performance than you were receiving with the last version of Mac OS or with Windows Server on comparable hardware. So getting an old machine that you've got sitting in the corner gathering dust and using that as your testing, playing, development machine can be a great way to get started. The second option is a virtual machine, and we're going to look at that shortly, where you run a virtual machine on other hardware. The final option is a cloud host, where you are using a cloud-based service like AWS or OVH or Azure or any of those other hosting providers. For many, you can get a server that's adequate for development and testing purposes for less than $10 a month to run a FileMaker server. And they will give you all of the performance that you need. When you're talking about production FileMaker servers, you're going to be paying a little bit more than that because you're going to need more RAM, more CPU. You're going to want to go with the tech specs. You're probably going to need more disk space because you're going to have to account for backups and so on. So you will pay a little bit more, but it's not incredibly expensive to do. Because you will be running the same operating system irrespective of whether you're running it on local hardware, in a VM, on a cloud host, the skills that you learn in one environment are directly transferable to the other. Because the operating system's the same, the installation is exactly the same. You're just going to learn your skills in one place and be able to immediately transfer them to other places.
For questions before or after?
Now, when they come up.
So, any difference, like performance-wise, between local, virtual, cloud hosting, or do you think you can get pretty comparable?
Yep. So the question is are there difference in performance, or can you get comparable? You can definitely get comparable. One of the things that you do need to consider in that regard is where users will be accessing the FileMaker server from. So if you are expecting that your users are quite distributed, then obviously you're going to end up with better performance with a cloud host. Otherwise, if you're having physical hardware that's in your office environment, for example, if many of your clients are external, then they'll be dealing with the potential congestion and the capacity of your internet connection.
So like we're all like in-house, like virtual versus local, free, you get that?
Yeah. So for in-house, if you're looking at running hardware in-house for in-house developers, then virtualization or physical hardware, you'll get more or less the same performance out of those. And in fact, quite a number of larger organizations that I've worked with, they will in fact get a great big, huge Dell server, and they will partition that up into lots of virtual servers on that one big block of physical hardware. And so in that way, they can run a development environment, a staging environment, a internal production environment, those sorts of things. And it's all running on one physical block of hardware, just within virtual machines on that physical hardware. And you will get comparable performance between them. Did you have another question?
I do. And it's about hardware.
Okay.
So have you worked with some of the new AI things with hardware with Linux, and what works well, GPUs?
Yes, but it's not really relevant to what we're talking about here because, yeah, absolutely, yeah. If you're trying to do stuff which is heavily resource intensive or using GPUs, then yeah, Linux is ultimately going to be the way that you'll go anyway. But certainly at present, nothing that Claris is providing us is working directly in that way. So I can discuss that with you later, as you wish. Okay, so let's get started. In this, I'm going to use a local virtual machine. On my Mac Mini, on my Mac laptop, I'm running a program called Parallels. Parallels is an application which lets us relatively easily create multiple virtual machines. I can have a Windows virtual machine, I can have other versions of Mac OS running in virtual machines, and I can have an infinite number of Linux machines. I can have one running at a time, I can have 7 running at a time. One of the great things about working with Parallels is that the virtual machine is just a file. It's a file that lives on your hard drive. And as long as the machine's not running, if you want to make a new one, you copy the file, you paste the file, you give it a new name, and now you've got another virtual machine. You don't have to install the operating system. You don't even have to install FileMaker Server again. If you've already installed it once, you shut the machine down, you copy it, you paste it, you start it up, and now you've got another server that's a complete clone of it directly, easily. What does that look like? In the control center, for Parallels, I've got 2 virtual machines. I've got one which is just my base Ubuntu Linux, that's just a fresh install of Linux 2204, and the second one I've installed FileMaker Server on. When I start up that FileMaker Server, what do I get? This. And I think that's the bit that most people find a little bit challenging, because all I get with Ubuntu and with Linux is I get a little command prompt that asks me to log in. And that's where my 6 important things we need to know about come in. The first thing that we obviously need to be able to do is we have to be able to connect to our server, to our Linux machine. Now, if we are running a local machine, we get that window. And that window is great because it's right there. If our machine is hardware that's in a rack down the hallway, that's the machine under my desk, it's a cloud server, then we need to be able to connect some other way. And the first thing that we need to know about is called SSH. And SSH stands for Secure Shell. And that's the way in which we can remotely connect from our local machine to a remote Linux machine. There are some other terms that you'll hear about that kind of go along with this. You get SFTP, which is not FTP. Many of you will have heard of FTP file transfer protocol, which you use for transferring files. And it's important not to get those things confused, because SSH and SCP are different to FTP, even though they kind of do the same thing. So, thing 1, SSH. If we want to connect to a remote server, then we will use a command line. On Mac OS, you get a terminal application installed immediately. It's great. There's another one called iTerm, which is another shell application that you run, which I find to be generally more user-friendly than terminal. If your local machine is Windows, then there's an application called Putty, P-U-T-T-Y, and that's the most commonly used tool for connecting via SSH on Windows. So we say SSH, I want to establish a secure shell. I say -i, and that is going to provide a secure key which will allow me to access my server. When you're working with cloud providers like AWS or Azure, when you create that machine, they ask you to provide a key, and you have what's called a key pair. You have your public key, which you give to your provider, like AWS, and you have your private key, and that lives just on your local machine. And so we have to say, where is the key that's allowed to access that machine? And then we say we want to connect to the username at the server name. And so that may be, in this case, I want to use the key that lives in my SSH folder. It's called MSD for Microsoft Development, for Multi Solutions Development, shared key, and I want to connect with the user Ubuntu to the server called engage25.msdev.nz. Yeah?
Does that mean that only that computer can do, or you can share the key?
Good question. The question is, only that computer, or can you share the key? You can absolutely share the keys. It's not the recommended way to do that. What you can do is you can allow multiple keys to be allowed to connect to the same machine with the same username. And there is something called an authorized keys file that lives on the remote server that you can add other public keys to, and then anyone with the private key that matches that, they will be able to access. So you can, for example, the MSD shared key, I have that on my laptop, and I also have a copy of that on my desktop machine. So I am sharing that key, but it's kind of my key. And so when I have other people need to access that server, I will ask them for their public key, I will add that to the server as an authorized key, and then they will be able to use their private key to connect. Right. Thing 1.5. I said that we have this thing called SSH, which lets us do a secure shell. It's how we connect to the machine. Thing 1.5 is SCP, which is its brother, cousin, sister, close relative. And it stands for secure copy. And what SCP does is it works using SSH to copy a file from one place to another. Now you can see, oh, hang on. We'll come back to that. We'll come back to that bit in a minute. With SCP, the thing that we're going to want to copy onto our remote machine, if we're trying to set up FileMaker Server, is we want to copy the installation file for FileMaker Server. Now, on Ubuntu operating systems, installation files come with a .deb, which stands for a Debian bundle, a .deb file. And we get that from the same place as we get all of the other installers. We get that from your account page in Claris. And you can see there that they offer Ubuntu 20 for AMD, which is the Intel chips, 22 AMD and 22 ARM. So if we download one of those files, which is a zip file, then we unzip that and we find in there our .deb file, our distribution file. And that is our installation file. It's kind of like a DMG, as you would have a disk image that you have on Mac, or an MSI, a Microsoft installer file that you have on Windows. The .deb file is the same thing. So we're going to end up downloading that on our local machine, and then we have to get that from our local machine onto our remote host. And this is where I was going with my SCP, so our secure copy. We do the same thing. We say -i and the path to our key, because we have to provide our key, our credentials, to allow us to access the server. We say where the file that we want to upload is, and then we say we want to copy it to user at server. So again, again, I would put my user as Ubuntu at, and the server is engage.msdev.nz. That link is just a blog post that has a little bit more detail about everything that I've just been saying for you. SSH and SCP are the only commands that we run on our local machine. Everything else that we're going to talk about from now on, you would use SSH to connect, and then you would run those commands on that remote machine. Thing number 2, sudo. Sudo stands for super user do. Now, on most cloud services, and when you set up an operating system on a virtual machine or on physical hardware, you will create a user, and that user will not be a super user. They'll just be a regular user. And it's a bit like in Windows, sometimes you have to right-click and go run as administrator. The same is true with Ubuntu. You will often have to do things as the root user, as the super user. And so you can say sudo and then some command that you want to run, or you can go sudo -i, and that just says go to an interactive shell. So you switch from being the user you logged into, Ubuntu, to the root user. And you will see that the command prompt that you see in your shell will change. When you run sudo -i, you will probably be asked for your password. Every user that's created on an Ubuntu system has a password, and you will also have keys that you use to connect. So you will often need to have both pieces of information. If you're installing Ubuntu yourself, then you will know what those are because you will have to create them. If you are using a cloud provider, then they will tell you what those are as you create that virtual machine. Thing number 3 is apt. apt comes after sudo because in order to run apt, you have to be the root user. You have to be that super user. Apt is the package manager for Ubuntu, and you use it to install, remove, and to update things on your server. So you might, for example, say apt upgrade. And what that will do is it will upgrade any of packages that you have installed. You can use apt auto remove to remove packages that are no longer needed on your server. And then you can use apt install, and you can tell it what you want to install. So in this case, I'm saying that I want to install Python 3. The packages that are available are broad and somewhat irrelevant to us because we're just going to run our FileMaker server on our FileMaker server, aren't we? We're not going to run anything else on there. Now, because FileMaker Server is distributed in this deb, this bundle, then we have to tell apt that we want to install that bundle. And so what we do, we use SCP to copy the bundle from our local machine to our host, and then on our host we would run sudo apt install, and we would give the path to that Debian bundle, that installer. When we hit go on there, we will get asked some questions, just standard questions like you would get asked when you're installing FileMaker Server. You just kind of agree with everything that it says. And it will ask you to create a user and a password for the admin console and so on. Oh, hang on, I'm going the wrong way. Auto remove, install. If for some reason we wanted to uninstall FileMaker Server, then we would say sudo apt remove FileMaker-server. And that will uninstall the FileMaker Server off that machine for us. So there we are. At this point, we've created, connected, installed. We've now got FileMaker Server up and running. Question?
Yeah. Does that do the same thing with open an app when you install? Keep the database.
Yep, the question is, if you do apt remove FileMaker Server, does it keep the databases folder? Yes, absolutely. It keeps the databases folder. It also keeps your configuration, like your backup schedules and scheduled scripts and all of that. It keeps the user data, but it uninstalls the services that are used and it uninstalls the FileMaker Server application. But yeah, your data is all still there. So I said there were 6 things, but we've got a FileMaker Server with only 3. The next 3 help us to manage our server over time. ls is like the dir in Windows Terminal. It gives a listing of the things that are in a directory. So if we go ls-la in our FileMaker Server folder, then we see all of the folders that are there. If you're familiar with looking at a FileMaker Server on Mac or Windows, then you'll recognize all of these somewhat hard to read because of the color folders that are there. One thing that we do need to know about with Ubuntu is that users are created automatically for various applications. You can see here that at the very left-hand side, we have some characters that represent whether the thing is a directory, whether we have read or write access to it, and so on. And then we can see that it says FM server and FMS admin. FM server is the name of the user that owns those folders. FMS admin is the name of the group that owns those folders. In order for FileMaker Server to be able to manage the content of the databases folder particularly, those folders need to be owned by the FM server user and the FMS admin group. If you use FileMaker Pro to upload a database to your FileMaker Server, it will automatically set those permissions for you. But there may be times where you need to modify that yourself. And that's where we get this command called chown. It's a contraction of change ownership. And so it allows us to set the ownership of a file. Now this might be necessary if, for example, you were using SCP to copy a number of database files onto your FileMaker server. Once you'd copied them onto there, you would need to give them to the correct user, the FM server and the FMS admin group. And so you would use chown to say, change the ownership to the user group of that file. For example, chown fm server.fmsadmin -r says do it recursively. So change everything that's in that folder to be owned by that user and that group. If you were to if you were to copy a file into the data file on your FileMaker server and not change the ownership, when you open it in FileMaker Pro, you'll get told that the file is read-only and that you can't make modifications to it. And that's your clue that you've skipped this step. One thing that's also worth mentioning is you'll see that FileMaker Server has a space in it. And I do wish that Claris hadn't done that because it's just a pain. You can see that in there is a backslash there, and that is the character that you use to escape the space. Because otherwise, if you left out that backslash before the space, wow, that's hard to say. If you left out the slash before the space, then you will get an error. It will tell you that there is no such folder, no such file as FileMaker or as server data. So that backslash becomes important. The last thing that we need to know about is the service command. The service command allows us to control services that run. The service that manages everything about FileMaker Server is called the FMS Helper service. And we can do things like we can start the service, we can stop the service, we can restart the service. So if we say sudo service FMS Helper stop, that will gracefully shut down the FileMaker Server service and therefore shut down FileMaker Server. You would use this command, for example, if you were going to do updates, if you were going to do apt update, to install updates. Looks like we're going all the way to the top this time. Great. So yeah, service FMS Helper stop, and that will stop the service for you and allow you to perform updates, restart the server, any of those sorts of things that you might want to do.
Is there a difference between doing this and doing FMS admin stop server?
Is there a difference between doing this and doing FMS admin stop server? Yes, there is, because if you stop the server in the admin console or using the admin API, you're only actually stopping the FileMaker Server database server and some of the peripheral services. You're not stopping the entire FileMaker Server, because you can still use the admin console to restart the database server. Whereas if you do service FMS Helper stop, you will actually stop everything. And so when you try to go to the admin console in a browser, you will get a timeout because it stopped the Nginx web server, it stopped the admin server, it stopped the database server, it stops everything. And this is necessary if you want to do a restart of the server. Yeah?
On a Mac server, sometimes we may have trouble shutting down a file that's hung up. Hit stop, admin console, and it's just there.
Yeah.
How does it act when you do this one?
So the question is, how does this, sometimes it's difficult to stop a file to close the database. How does this behave? This will initially try the same processes, and so you can sometimes find that if you do FMS Helper stop, that it will take a very long time, and sometimes it may in fact never stop. Eventually the operating system will go, nah, she's gone, and will stop the service for you. And at that point you do run the risk of corruption in your file. Sorry?
Behavior is due to only one thing, not the backup.
Okay, so the comment is that there's the
FileMaker will try to stop the time. The backup running will just pause the action, and then when the backup will be finished, the file will be closed. And that can be a big issue.
Yeah.
Because sometimes your backup will take 2 or 3 hours. You try to close the file, it didn't close, come back later, and then 3 hours later, your file is gone.
Okay, so the comment is that the cause of this is a backup running, which could take some hours. Just be patient, I guess. If you use stop the FileMaker service, the FMS helper service, it will terminate the service eventually, potentially before your backup has concluded. And restart it, you can also run, which will stop and then restart the service as well. The final one is you can get the status of the service. This can be very useful if you are experiencing parts of your FileMaker server seeming not to be running. For example, if it appears that the script engine is not running or the data API is not running, because FMS helper status will show you the status of all of the processes that are part of FileMaker server. If you were in Clay's session yesterday, you will have seen that columnar type diagram that he showed, which showed that FileMaker server is made up of a bunch of different components. And the service FMS helper status will show you the status of each of those components at the time. One other thing that I mentioned in response to a question was about the web server. In recent versions of FileMaker Server, they're using the Nginx web server. Older versions used Apache, newer versions use Nginx. Sometimes that Nginx service needs its own investigation, and it has this really weird and unhelpful name because it's the Nginx service that's installed by FileMaker. Although the service is called start, you can actually stop the start service. When you can restart the start service and you can get the status of the start service, and that will tell you about the status of FileMaker's Nginx instance. And that can be helpful if you're trying to troubleshoot why the data API is not working, why your admin console isn't showing as it should. And that one is always tricky to remember the name of that service and to find it, so it's in my slides when you need to remember what it is next time you want to know about it. Yeah, hit the up arrow a few times till you find last time you ran it is another option. So those are our 6 things. Our 6 things that we need in order to be somewhat competent in running a Linux FileMaker server. We need SSH, the secure shell. That's how we'll connect from our local machine to our remote server. We need SCP, its cousin, which allows us to copy files from our local machine to that host. Also worth mentioning, it allows us to copy files back again. So we can, for example, use SCP to copy the last backup off the server onto our local machine if we wanted to retrieve files in that way. Sudo allows us to act as the super user, the root user that has full control. And for anything like installation, you will need to use sudo. apt lets us install, remove, and update applications. ls provides a listing of a directory. chown changes the ownership of a file or a folder. And service allows us to start, stop, and manage services on our Ubuntu server. Yeah.
So if you use secure copy, you move your database into place, and change the permission, you shouldn't need to change the permissions as well? No.
The question is, if you use secure copy to copy your database and you change the ownership, you shouldn't need to change the permissions as well. That is correct. You shouldn't need to change the permissions as well.
When you're in SSH, can you use the GUI to manage the services? You know, the FileMaker Server admin tool, console rather?
The question is, once you're in with SSH, can you use the admin console to manage the services?
Yeah.
You can, once the FileMaker Server is installed, you can use the web-based admin console to manage everything about the FileMaker Server that you can on any other operating system. And you don't need to be connected via SSH in order to use the admin console once the server is installed. You would simply use the browser as if it were any other operating system in the back end. Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes I like to lock that down to certain actions.
To restrict access to the admin console, absolutely, yeah. And we'll get to firewalls shortly.
Okay. Two, I think one's quick.
Okay.
But, so there's zero advantage to installing the GUI.
There's zero advantage to installing the GUI. Unless you are like the Ubuntu GUI, the desktop, there is zero advantage to doing that unless you are installing it on physical hardware in your office that you can plug a monitor into. There is no point using the desktop version of Ubuntu if it's on a cloud server. You have no way to access the desktop. Question 2?
Yeah, question 2 is everything with the Linux installation, like there's full parity across the platform, everything that works with Windows, this version of FileMaker Server?
Yep. The question is there full parity with FileMaker Server? Almost. The one thing that you don't get with Ubuntu is you don't get the deprecated XML interface, and therefore you don't get the deprecated PHP API, which means that if you're doing any custom web publishing that uses either the XML interface or the PHP API, you can't use Ubuntu. You would have to modify that to use either the data API or OData. Otherwise, there is full parity. And in fact, we have seen times recently where functionality has come first to the Linux version of FileMaker Server and then to the Mac version and then eventually to Windows. So oftentimes, it seems we're going to see new stuff on the Ubuntu version before we see it on the other operating systems. Sorry? The PHP API.
They don't install PHP anymore.
No.
But the XML engine.
Yeah, it is, but yeah, you're going to have difficulty connecting to it without doing a whole bunch of other stuff as well. So, having just spent the last 40 minutes or thereabouts telling you about how to do all of this manually, I'm going to tell you that there's actually a way easier way to do it. And that might make you feel a little bit more comfortable about it. But the important thing is you kind of have to have some understanding of what the automation that I'm about to show you and talk to you about is going to do. We're going to tiny little bit of theory about the agile transformation. The idea behind it was about increasing collaboration and removing silos, and it kind of led to this concept of DevOps, about developer operations, where developers and operations people worked together to make that thing about, I built it, you run it, well, it works on my machine, but it doesn't work in production, to try and get away from that sort of thing. And one of the artifacts of this was the idea of infrastructure as code. And so in the same way as you write code to run an application, you write code in your FileMaker application, then you can write code to manage your infrastructure. It's a way to ensure that you can have replication of activity and to simplify things for you. Infrastructure as code basically says that you define your configuration and your dependencies in code. You can run that code against one server, or you can run that code against many servers, and you can run it again and again and again. And the great thing about it is you'll always get the same result, because you are running a known set of steps in a specific order to ensure that you will always get that same result. What's that got to do with deploying FileMaker Server? It means that we can automate it. And that's great, because it means a whole lot less work for us. There are a whole bunch of different tools that have come out of this DevOps environment. There's one called Puppet, there's one called Chef, and I'm going to talk about one now called Ansible. The idea with Ansible is apparently it's simple IT automation, not very helpful. Wikipedia says it's an open source software for provisioning, configuration management, and application deployment tool enabling infrastructure as code. The idea behind it is you write code and it does something for you. It manages, in this case, a server. Ansible's written in Python. Not really important to us, but interesting to know. It uses this thing called YAML, which some people say stands for yet another markup language. Maybe. It's just a way of writing infrastructure as code. And you use YAML to create an inventory, to create a role, and to create some templates. And you combine all of those into something called a playbook. And a playbook performs tasks in the role on remote servers in the inventory. So basically it says, do these things in this order to this server. Now if you think about installing FileMaker Server, we copy the file, we run the installer, we do a few more bits of tidy up, and we're done. Okay, I'm actually going to try this on actual conference Wi-Fi. I'll explain as we go along about what's happening. But basically, what I've done is I created, yesterday afternoon, in the OVH data center in Toronto, a FileMaker server, a server that I gave the DNS entry name of engage.msdev.nz. If you get your devices out and try and connect to it right now, you're not going to get anything because it's just a standard, bare bones Ubuntu 22.04 server. That's all that's on there at present. Do that so I can see what I'm doing as well. Here is, and these windows have got all out of position. Here is a command prompt running in iTerm on my local machine. And I am saying that I'm going to use the command called Ansible Playbook. Now I said that Ansible, you create inventories, roles, and templates, and you combine them all into a playbook. And so we'll have a look at the playbook in a minute. So we're going to say Ansible Playbook. We're going to say run the file called fms YAML, and the inventory that we want is the host's inventory. Now when I hit enter on that, Ansible is going to start up, and it's going to start running through the process of configuring that engage.msdev.nz server as a FileMaker server. And so the first thing that it's doing is it's installing Python. Now I said Ansible was written in Python, and so it's going to go off and it's going to run through all of the steps that we need to convert a boring Ubuntu server into a FileMaker server, install an SSL certificate, and we're going to be done. In a couple of minutes, it's going to have done that all for us. As it works its way through, I'm just going to switch over to here, and we're just going to run through. This is the playbook. This is the role to install FileMaker Server on Ansible. Now, lots of the things that are happening in here are going to seem familiar to you from the first half of my talk. We're using apt, and we're making sure that the server is up to date by using apt, and we're going to auto-clean, auto-remove, upgrade, update the cache. We're going to make sure that that server is completely up to date. We create a folder for the installer, and then we copy the installer to the host. Now you can see here that I've got these funny braces with values in them. They are all coming from my variables file. And in here, you can see that I'm specifying a whole lot of variables. And I'm saying that the installer file name is this deb file. And I'm setting here an admin user password. Very, very secure. I highly recommend this password be used on all FileMaker servers. Don't ever use that password. A PIN number, and so on. So we copy the installer, we copy the license certificate. If I look here on the right, you'll see here is my installer file, and here is my license certificate. So I'm copying them onto the server. Many of you will be familiar with the idea of the assisted install file. It's a way that allows you to automate the installation of both FileMaker Client and FileMaker Server. And so in that assisted install file, it has a particular pattern that we follow. We say that we want to accept the license. We tell it what the admin username and password and PIN should be. We tell it where the license certificate is. And that all goes in this file, which we copy onto the server. Then we run the installer. We're using apt again because apt is the package installer. It's the thing that we use to install. And we say that we want to install that Debian file that we uploaded. There's some commented out bits in here because you may want to use your own SSL certificate that you want to copy over. And then, or you may want to use certbot, which is something we'll come back to in a moment, but that's the Let's Encrypt certbot, which after the keynote I'm thrilled to see is not going to be a thing anymore, and that's going to be super exciting. But basically what we're doing is we're using the FMS admin, the command line tool, to import that certificate. And then we do some tidying up. We take away the installation directory. We create this dummy file to say that we've installed an SSL certificate. We can close the sample file, although I noticed that in the latest releases that's not there anymore. So that's a win, because that was always a pain, having to get rid of that file. I also like to configure the time zone on my server so that it's correct, and then we restart the server. If we hop back over to here, we can see that it's been running through all of those steps as I've been telling you what it's going to do. And you can see there that it's saying that it has changed underneath each of those tasks. And then the final one was restart the server to apply permissions and the imported certificate. That worked out well. So in theory, if I hop over, no, where's my browser gone? If I hop over to my browser, which doesn't seem to want to open. Oh, there we go. And I go to https engage.msdev.nz. I get the website. If I go here to the admin console and log in with my super secure password, we find that we've got a fully running FileMaker server on an Ubuntu machine that 7 minutes ago was just an Ubuntu machine. And conveniently, we've got an installed SSL certificate that's good until the 23rd of June, 2025. And all of that from just one command on my local machine. And the really cool thing is that if, so long as in my hosts file here, I say what machine I want to run, and in here, in my config file, I have the IP address, the username, and, sorry, that's really tiny. The IP address, the username, and the key. I can run that against any Ubuntu server that I can access, and it will turn that into a fully functional FileMaker server in about 7 minutes. And that is cool. It's really cool for people that are doing hosting. It's really cool for people that are involved in the ETS program. It's really cool for people that want to be able to easily run FileMaker servers. I can run that playbook against a virtual machine running on my laptop. I can run it against hardware down the end of the corridor. I can run it against a cloud machine. Command F1. Sorry, okay. Now I mentioned Let's Encrypt, and this bit of my talk will be obsolete in a version, oh, come on. Will be obsolete in a version of FileMaker Server coming to you quite soon, and that is super cool. In the meantime, Let's Encrypt is great because for many years now, it has allowed us to automate the installation of SSL certificates. Let's Encrypt certificates are only valid for 3 months, which sounds like a bit of a pain, but the Let's Encrypt process actually will automatically renew that certificate at 60 days out. So it will constantly automatically renew that. You do have to do a little bit of configuration of the Let's Encrypt service to allow it to manage the FileMaker Server part of it. And unfortunately, FileMaker Server doesn't like importing symlinks or aliases, so you have to jump through a few hoops to get the number of the certificate version out. But that's relatively straightforward because, of course, what do you use to install certbot? You use Ansible. So you automate the installation of certbot and you automate the installation of the changes that you need. Ansible allows you to automate many, many different things. And there is this concept of a galaxy, an Ansible galaxy. And in that galaxy, you find roles that you can download, roles to do things like install certbot, install a firewall, install FileMaker Server, install anything that you like as part of your process. There is a guy called Jeff Gilling who goes by the name of Gilling Guy, and he has produced roles for many, many different things. And his roles, he's one of the authors of Ansible, and so he's very, very much involved in the Ansible community, and his roles are of good quality and they're always up to date. So soon we're not going to have to do those two things because FileMaker or Claris have decided that they're going to do it for us. But our final playbook, our playbook that gets a properly configured server at this point, it involves 4 roles. It involves the role, the Gilling Guy firewall role, and that will install a firewall. And someone mentioned about locking down access to the admin console. So you would use that firewall role to say, I only want to allow access to this path from these IP addresses, and so on. You'd use Gilling Guy certbot to install the Let's Encrypt certificate installer. You'd use the FMS role that I ran through before to install FileMaker Server. And then there's a role called FMS certbot, which performs the configuration of certbot to specifically interact with FileMaker Server. What else can you do? You can automate anything. So other things that I do as part of my deployments, you can interact with the data API from Ansible. For example, I have a web application that I deploy using Ansible onto a client's web server. When that's done, as part of that process, it gets the commit from Git and it uses the data API to create a record in a FileMaker table that says on this date at this time, this version of the web application was deployed. So in my Ansible scripts, I'm interacting with the data API to ensure that we have logging and tracking going on. We can install other applications that we need. Oftentimes people are using Dropbox to store their backups. So we can use an Ansible role to install Dropbox and to automate all of that for us. We can put shell scripts on there. We can use the FMS admin command line to import configuration for schedules and backups and those sorts of things. We can configure multiple servers simultaneously. In my inventory, I just had one host listed, engage.msdev.nz. I could have listed 7 servers in there, and the playbook would step through and perform each task on each server, and then move on to the next server, and so on. You can also automate the use of the data migration tool. Less relevant now that AutoFMS is free, because that automates the data migration tool way more easily for us. Where do we get all that stuff from? Here are some resources, particularly the playbook that I was using now and how to connect to the data API, there are a couple of URLs at the end of there that will take you to a couple more blog posts that I've written that help with those tasks. The data API is perhaps no longer the best choice. OData, the OData API would actually be easier because the authentication is a little easier in that. But I've been using the data API for a while. We've got minus 14 seconds for questions. The good news is that it's lunchtime now, so I'm more than happy to take questions. I'll be around for a while. I'll take questions now. Just before we do that, please rate the session. It's super useful for me, and it really helps inform Claris. That QR code will take you directly to my session in the Engage to Go app to help you rate it straight away. If people want to head away, that's great. If people have got questions, I'm more than happy to take them now as well.